Welcome back. Now, we are going to work on simplifying trigonometric expressions, but this time we are going to reduce the number of trigonometric functions into one by using what we call as R factor. Mathematically speaking, we can write a times sine x plus minus b times cosine x as r times sine x plus some angle alpha, or if it is written the other way around, like a times cosine x plus minus b times sine x, then we can write this as r times cosine x plus minus some angle alpha. So the idea is to find the value of r and this angle so that we can reduce the number of trigonometric functions into one. Why will we do that? Because it's easier to solve trigonometric equations if there is only one function. That's why. Generally speaking, the value of r will be considered as positive, and alpha will always be in the first quadrant. So it's either 90 degrees or pi over 2 at this end of the inequality. Right. Now let's see an example on how we can simplify such expressions. In this example, I'm asked to write down sine x minus root 3 cosine x in the form of r times sine x minus alpha in brackets, where r is positive and alpha is in the first quadrant. So the question is asking us to find r and alpha. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to equate these expressions. Now when you look at this equation, there is nothing else to do but expanding this expression. So it's going to be like this. Now I'm going to expand the brackets and I'll have r times sine x cosine alpha minus r times cosine x sine alpha on the right hand side. At this point, I am going to match these expressions like sine x appears in here. So these two expressions altogether must be equal. And here there's cosine x and here there's cosine x. So these two expressions must be equal. So I'm going to write these as separate equations. I'm going to say r times sine x cosine alpha equals sine x, and r times cosine x sine alpha equals root 3 cosine x. Notice that I ignored the minus sign here while writing this equation here, because even if I write it, I'm going to simplify them anyway. So it's r cosine x sine alpha equals root 3 cosine x. Now you can see that sine x here simplifies with sine x here. So I have r times cosine alpha being 1. Well, this is multiplication here, so I divide both sides by sine x. So sine x divided by sine x is 1, right? So careful with that, it's not 0. And here, it's going to be r times sine alpha here, because I'm going to simplify cosine x's. So r times sine alpha will be square root of 3. Now looking at these two equations, it appears that I have to work on finding r first, because if I try to find alpha by using the inverse trigonometric functions, I will have r within the equation. So I can't actually find the value of alpha because I don't know r. So let's start working on r. I'm going to use sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1 here. Now let's write it down together with r. So I'm going to take the square of these and add them. So I'll write r times sine alpha squared plus r times cosine alpha squared equals, well, r times sine alpha is root 3. So I'm going to write root 3 squared plus r times cosine alpha is 1. So it's going to be 1 squared. Now it's going to be r squared sine squared alpha plus r squared cosine squared alpha. Well, root 3 squared is 3, 1 squared is 1. And on the left-hand side, if I take into r squared brackets, it's going to be sine squared alpha plus cosine squared alpha equals 4. And we know that sine squared alpha plus cosine squared alpha is 1. So basically, I end up with r squared being 4 and r being 2. Not minus 2 because r is given to be positive. Now that I know r is 2, I can write down the value of r into those equations. So it's going to be 2 times sine alpha being root 3 and 2 times cosine alpha being 1. I can use any one of those to find out the value of alpha. So let's use this one. Now I have to leave cosine alpha alone, so it's going to be cosine alpha equals 1 over 2, and alpha equals cosine inverse of 1 over 2. So alpha will be pi over 3. Notice that we are given the interval for alpha from 0 to pi over 2, which means I have to write alpha in radians. Now that I know alpha and r, I can write this expression in terms of r sine x minus alpha in brackets. So let's do that. So sine x minus root 3 cosine x is nothing but 2 times sine x minus pi over 3. So that is how I express sine x minus root 3 cosine x as in the form r times sine brackets x minus alpha. Now you will see that the first part of questions will be of this form. So what could be the second part of the questions? So they can ask you to solve a certain equation. They could say sine x minus root 3 cosine x equals 5. So solve this equation. So instead of using this expression, you'll be using this expression to solve it because it's easier. Or they can ask you to graph the expression. So graph this function. So instead of graphing this, you're going to be graphing this because it's easier. Or you could be asked to find a minimum and maximum values of this expression. I'm not going to be solving an equation, that's out of the scope of this video, but I'm going to show how to graph it and how to find the maximum minimum. So let's say part B is sketch the graph of y equals sine x minus root 3 cosine x. Now it is not impossible to draw the graph of this, but you have to include the calculations for 2 trigonometric ratios. The best way is to make a proper table and draw scales and everything. But if you have this expression reduced to 2 times sine x minus pi over 3, you can directly apply the transformation rules and sketch the graph. Now this is sine x. Minus pi over 3 means I'm going to move this graph on the x-axis to right by pi over 3. So it's going to look like this. And if I double it, I'm going to get something like this. So just because I have only one trigonometric function here, I can deal with it easily compared to this equation. So this is one of the questions that might be asked in part B. Another alternative could be solving an equation, and we talked about it. And the third alternative could be, for example, find the maximum value of y equals sine x minus root 3 cosine x, exactly the same expression, and the value of x at which it occurs. So let's work on this now. We know that this function sine x minus root 3 cosine x is the same as 2 times sine x minus pi over 3. This is what we have found in the beginning. Now this is easy because we know that sine of any angle will be a maximum of 1. So 2 times 1 will be 2. If we were to ask the minimum, we would go like the minimum is minus 1 for sine of any angle. So it's going to be 2 times minus 1 is minus 2. But just because it's maximum asked here, we have to go with the answer being 2. Now keep this in mind. There may be harder expressions for a function given in the question. you should always reduce that expression to form of r sine x minus alpha or r cosine x minus alpha. All right, this is crucial. If you can write that expression in terms of r times sine or cosine x minus alpha, maybe it is plus, it is also possible, right? Then you can discuss the minimum and maximum value, because if you have two trigonometric functions, finding the minimum and maximum may be tricky. So you have to reduce it to one trigonometric function. Now let's practice these a little bit. I want to draw your attention to the third question. Now the expression is given to be cosine theta minus root 3 sine theta plus 2. Well, while converting it to this form, in the beginning, ignore this bit and work on this part, okay? And convert it to this form. And then you will see that this number will be nothing but 2, all right? So careful with this part. So as always, please solve these questions on your book and do the online self-check in the website. Thanks for watching.